I'm Amber Campbell. I am the project manager for Great Plains Grazing, and today I'm going to introduce to you David Lalman, who is an associate professor at Oklahoma State University in animal science. He will be presenting on matching cows to forage resources. And with that, I'm going to let David take over, and I'm going to turn off my video.
Thank you, Amber. And let me ask you one more question about the software. So can you all see, can they all see my cursor?
Yes, we can see your cursor.
Okay, good. Well, I'll try not to annoy you too much with it, but it might come in handy. Well, Amber asked me to talk about this topic that we've been presenting a few times in the last, I don't know, 3 or 4 years relative to matching cows to forage resources. And it's been a very interesting topic and one that's been fun to visit with producers about. And of course, as we enter into an era, or assuming that we are entering into a time period where drought will become potentially more severe and possibly more frequent, this topic winds up being a relatively high priority, or at least an opportunity to mitigate the effects of drought. And so hopefully the reasons why that is the case will become more apparent as we go through the presentation. And so if I could get trying to get my PowerPoint to advance here. So as we do that, I think it's good to put our history or past in perspective. And this first part of the presentation is a component of Dr. Bob Tasha Scheck's presentation given several years ago at the Oklahoma Cattlemen's Association convention. And relative to the history of our industry, he said that in the 1940s and 50s, the cattle industry entered into an era of insanity. And what he was talking about, of course, is the selection for cattle to the extreme in terms of small mature size and body composition, with that leaning towards excessive fat. As you can see in this picture here, this is a picture of the Grand Champion Angus female at the Chicago International Expo, which at the time was the premier livestock show probably in the world, and certainly in the United States. And so, you know, it's interesting that seed stock producers and industry leaders felt like this was the best or most efficient, most optimal phenotype at that time period. And so selection pressure was applied, and this body type was accomplished, as you can see. And of course, this is one picture of many thousands that we could show during that time period. This is what the show cattle looked like. Then Dr. Tasha Scheck said in his presentation a few years ago, he said in the 1960s, the industry began to recognize that the pendulum had swung too far, and therefore there was a era of recognition of the need to change. And so this is about the same time the continental breeds were being brought into the U.S. beef cattle industry, and people began to select for cattle once again with larger mature frame size. This is an example of cattle like that. This is 1969. This is the Grand Champion steer there at the Chicago International once again. If you're from Kansas State, like Amber and Atlanta, and of course I graduated from K-State, that Conoco, this is steer's name's Conoco, he shows up on the animal science building wall at several locations. Conoco is kind of famous because This gentleman right here is Dr. Don Good, who would later become the department head there at Animal Science, and he selected Conoco as a grand champion there in 1969. Of course, the unique thing about that is that this is the first time a crossbred steer had been selected as a grand champion. But if you look at Conoco's phenotype, obviously he is larger framed and more of a moderate phenotype compared to those cattle in the 40s and 50s. Dr. Tasha Scheck said then, you know, it was, the mentality was kind of if a little bigger is good, a lot bigger must be better. And so he felt like in the 70s and 80s, or he coined this term, that the cattle industry had a return to insanity. And of course, this is the phenotype that he's referring to. And we've got a lot of pictures like this also. Many of you would probably recall this era. And if the other cattle were belt buckle cattle, these are, maybe you could refer to these as hat band cattle. But extreme selection, or selection for cattle with extreme mature size, was in at the time, and of course that spilled over into breeding cattle, obviously. And this is one of the more famous Angus bulls at the time that was used heavily throughout the country through artificial insemination. And so the pendulum swung back the other way, and this phenotype or genetic selection also created substantial number of problems for the industry. Extremely large carcass weights, cattle that would not grade choice that are moderate carcass weight had to be fed for a long period of time. Females that did not cycle at an early age or become pubertal at an early age, and cows that had a hard time maintaining their flesh with low to moderate inputs. Then in the 90s and 2000s, of course, the industry recognized that there were many problems associated with that phenotype of cattle, and so here we are back again with more moderate type cattle. Particularly if you go to a show today, you'll see that this more moderate mature size is kind of what's popular right now in the show cattle world, and that's true for cattle on commercial operations as well. And so the question is, an interesting question we began asking about 4 years ago, was that, are we getting any closer if we assume that, you know, we're talking about a commercial operation with low to moderate inputs? Are we getting closer? Is our selection today getting us closer to commercial cows that are better matched to our forage resources? And if that's true, you know, what are the indications or measurements we can use to see that happening? So all I want to do is just show you 3 data sets here real quick that kind of just give a real fundamental look at that question. And these data sets from the Kansas Farm Management Association, from the North Dakota Cowherd Appraisal Performance Software, and then from the Standardized Performance Analysis Summary that combines 3 states' data, and that's New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas. So if we first look at weaning weight, it's interesting in the southwestern states. Basically, there's been no change over time in weaning weights, and you can see the effects of the extreme drought in 2011 in weaning weights, because everyone, and further south you went in the southern Great Plains, the more extreme the drought was. And so those calves had to be weaned very early that summer because there just was no forage. A lot of the cows were sold. But over time, it looks like there's really no substantial change in weaning weights in the Southwest, which was a surprise to me when I first saw this. Kansas, looks like there's a little more variation there early on, but basically since about 2001 or 2002, there appears to be no sustained increase in the Kansas data either. North Dakota, some kind of noise the first few years, but then there from about 1996 up until the mid-2000s, looks like there was kind of some gradual progress made in winning weights over recent years here. It looks like maybe that has leveled off. So surprisingly, in general, in commercial cattle operations, the last 10 years or so, I think we could safely say that there has been no substantial increase in calf weaning weights. If you look at weaning rates or reproduction, and of course this is the percentage of cows that wean a calf relative to the number of cows that were exposed to a bull the previous year. And what you see here is a similar, I guess you call this a trend but it's flat. There is no change basically over time, quite a bit of variability there, but between 80 to 85% weaning rate throughout the years here in the southwestern states. It's interesting that if you look at the Kansas data and the North Dakota data for weaning rate, that they're substantially higher relative to the southern states. So in Oklahoma, we average around 82, you might argue 83% weaning rate. Kansas and North Dakota, it's 89 to 91 over the last 10 years or so. So it's an interesting question that we're asking ourselves in the southern states. Why is there such a difference in weaning rates? I'm just going to check my chat here and make sure I'm not missing a question. Doesn't look like it. Okay, so, and then the other thing, probably the most important point for this presentation is that there's no substantial change in fertility over time in commercial cow-calf operations. So that kind of leads to the question, well, if weaning weights and weaning rate or fertility is not improving, at least it doesn't appear to be declining substantially, but it certainly doesn't appear to be improving either. So could you make the argument that cattle are more forage efficient? And since we don't have a large national database on either one of these questions, this one may be even more challenging to answer. But I've got a little bit of data here that I think is really interesting to consider. And that is Dr. Darrell Peel shared with me our Oklahoma data from our Department of Agricultural Statistics Service. And what he shows is the state's inventory for beef cows relative to hay production over time. And that's what you see here. You've got the hay yield on the left axis and time on the x-axis here. And that just shows really no change. This is all grass hay production throughout the state of Oklahoma. It does not include alfalfa or other legumes. Here's the hay acres per beef cow in the Oklahoma inventory. And what you see there is a pretty steep increase in hay acres per beef cow over time. And then if we pull those two together and you calculate hay production or tons of hay produced per beef cow, this is kind of what it looks like. And of course, in the last few years, particularly there in 2011, there's a real steep decline and a lot of variability from year to year. But it's really interesting that, back in the 1960s, we consistently fed somewhere around 1/2 to 3/4 ton of hay per cow. And now in the industry, we're averaging feeding around 2 tons of harvested hay per cow. So if our cattle are more forage efficient, you wouldn't think we would be doing this. Granted, there may be and probably are other reasons for this to occur, not just that the cows require more hay. That may be part of the reason this is happening, but there are other possibilities too, including, maybe a lot of people have access to hay that's less expensive to feed their cows than, say, for example, they could go out and rent more pasture. If pasture costs are extremely high, that certainly could be a factor here. The other thing that's interesting to consider is, if you think about what was invented somewhere right in this era, somewhere in the late 1970s, and that's a round baler. And so that made hay production less expensive and more convenient from a labor standpoint, and that's the point in time when our hay production and hay feeding really went up in the cattle industry. So probably several reasons why that's going on. So cattle are changing. Here you see a picture of a European cow that was a champion in 1835 and an OSU, a grand champion steer, shorthorn steer in 1937. Some of those same drastic changes. Well, those kind of changes are occurring today. We're going to look at them here for the next few minutes. They're just not as easy to see because it doesn't all have to do with visual phenotype. Let's talk about milk production to start off with. And this is a slide that shows the genetic trend over time for milk production. These are EPDs that have been adjusted to an Angus base. Okay, so you should be able to compare one breed to another here. And so what you see is that other than a few breeds, and I've only got, I think there's 7 breeds listed here because we don't want the slide to get too busy, but this is the Simmental breed, and you can see that they have declined in milk production over time. But the rest of the breeds shown on this slide are gradually increasing or aggressively selecting for more genetic potential for milk. And that's kind of what I want you to realize. There are a few breeds that have backed off like Simmental, but not very many. But all of the breeds that have either been steady in genetic trend for milk or declining are breeds that came into the U.S. as dual purpose breeds. In other words, they had a lot of milk to begin with. It's interesting that right now Angus and Simmental cattle have about the same genetic potential for milk. And we didn't used to think that or be able to say that. So that's been, as you can see here, a very dramatic change over time. Also, it's interesting to me that currently the Hereford breed is getting pretty close or just about where the Angus breed was about a little over 20 years ago. So you cannot think about some of these characteristics in cattle today, the way we used to think about them 20 years ago. They have changed dramatically. So what about milk production and matching forage resources? The thing is that there's no question, quite a bit of literature shows that more milk equals higher year-long maintenance requirements. Okay, whether she's lactating or not, her need for nutrients are greater if she has higher genetic potential for milk. That phenomenon is related to greater visceral organ mass relative to empty body weight. If you think about the dairy cow, dairy cows have a very large rumen. They have a very large small and large intestine. They have a large liver, heart, and kidneys. It takes a lot of that extremely metabolically active tissue to drive the milk production factory. And that's why their maintenance requirements are higher 365 days a year. Another issue, second issue relative to milk, and that is the efficiency of more milk to increase calf weight gain. A very simple idea. It's just like feed efficiency in the feed yard. But we really haven't paid a whole lot of attention to that. There's considerable amount of data published in the literature on this. I'm just going to show you one study here. And this study from Lewis, published back in 1990, They had a set of cows bred for high milk production, a set of cows bred for medium and low milk yield. Okay, this line represents the cows bred to have low milk yield on average. And what this slope shows is that the conversion efficiency of one additional pound of calf weaning weight required, and this is in kilograms, but it doesn't matter, it's on a one-to-one basis, 11.8 pounds of milk to get one additional pound of calf weaning weight. Okay, if you started with the medium set of cows, that slope of that regression line is 15.2 pounds of milk to obtain an additional pound of calf weaning weight. And then when you got to the cows that started out with high genetic potential for milk, that slope is 52.6 pounds of milk to get one additional pound of calf weaning weight. So as you can see, the efficiency declines pretty dramatically as you increase genetic potential for milk yield. The other interesting thing to think about here is that what's really going on, I think, is that, you know, this only measures the efficiency of milk production, but these calves are also consuming forage. And so these calves are probably not consuming very much forage. These calves are consuming a lot of forage. And so what we're doing is swapping forage for milk, and that would really devastate that ratio, and I think that's what's happening. That's why it turns out to be not very efficient. Third thing, and the final thing we'll talk about here relative to milk production is I encourage people to think about this question. And that is a very simple question. That is there a limit of milk production that your forage can support? So if you think about a high-producing dairy cow, you know, most of those are maintained in an environment where, you know, they have a freestall barn, near ad libitum feed intake, probably something like a 50% alfalfa hay and silage diet, 50% concentrate feed, and so they're on a pretty high quality diet. Now, if you took those cows out of that environment and you turned them out on, let's just say, native range land during the late fall and winter, what would happen to their milk yield? Well, it would decline dramatically. Obviously, we didn't change that cow's genetic potential. Didn't change that at all. The only thing we changed was her environment. And so that dry forage, senescent, moderate to low quality forage, simply cannot support that extreme level of milk yield. And so my question then would be, is that happening on beef cattle operations around the country? And it's just difficult to measure because we don't milk our cows every day and we don't know how much forage they consume. The answer is yes, it is happening. This is some data that Dr. Mike Brown and I published in 2005. And what you see here is a wide range in milk EPD, and these are Brangus cows, and this is expressed in kilograms. But the sires of these cows had from extremely low milk potential to extremely high milk potential in the Brangus breed. And what happens is that this is 24-hour milk yield continues to increase, and this is just native rangeland these cows are grazing on. Milk yield continues to increase until you get up here in the middle of the Brangus breed's range of milk production, or milk EPD. And so basically from this point, somewhere right in here to the right represents cows that would have higher maintenance requirement. Remember the conversation from earlier. So a factory that's more expensive to run but producing no more widgets, if that makes sense. They're producing no more milk. And that's because those forage resources can only support that somewhere in this neighborhood maximum of milk, and the optimum is probably somewhere to the left of that. Okay, so I think it's the increasing risk or frequency of cases where forage resources limit the expression of the genetic potential for milk. And another interesting way to look at this is, I suspect there are a lot of cases where production costs have increased because the environment has been artificially modified to fit the kind of cows that we like, if you think about that. So what we've done probably is selected for more milk over time, which those genetic trends show that we have in many breeds. But what we've done is either reduced our stocking rate, maybe gradually started to feed hay longer, feed it a little bit earlier in the year, feed it longer in the spring, possibly feed another pound or two of supplement than we did 5 or 6, 7 years ago, all in an attempt to keep from letting reproduction suffer or weaning rates or pregnancy rates go down. This is a kind of an example of a tool that you should consider utilizing, and it's the Angus Breed's Optimal Milk Module. And here you see I've got outlined, you just go on their website and look for data searches and tools and Optimal Milk Module. It's free to use, and just in a few minutes inputting your costs and your cow size and a few other things, it will give you an estimated range or a range of optimal milk EPD that they suggest or recommend for your operation based on the inputs that you provided. When I do this on their optimal milk module for the research unit that I'm responsible for here west of Stillwater, Oklahoma, the answer I get is 15 to 19 pounds of milk EPD in the Angus breed. Okay, and so if you think about that and you look through sale catalogs and so on, it's hard to find bulls with that low of a milk EPD in today's industry. And so just a caution that the pendulum may be swinging too far relative to milk production. Last topic then, we're going to blend all these together and then we'll wrap it up with just a few kind of common sense suggestions or recommendations to keep that pendulum from swinging too far and better match cows to resources. And we'll talk just a minute about mature size, muscle, and growth because they all kind of go together. This is the genetic trend for yearling weight, and I think most people probably recognize this, but it's apparent. It doesn't matter what breed you put on this chart. The cattle industry has been in I call it the never-ending arms race for growth, and that's been going on for a long time, and we continue that trend. Well, so the question then, I'm kind of curious about is there any antagonisms relative to commercial cows in a moderate to low input environment? And the answer is actually yes, it appears like there is. This shows the phenotypic trend for mature weight and Hereford cattle. You can see that even here we're coming out of the first era of insanity, and here we kind of go through what Dr. Tasha Scheck called the era of insanity and then more moderation or leveled off. But notice that cow weights continue to gradually creep up, at least in the Hereford breed. It's a little different, but it's the genetic trend for mature weight in the Angus breed. And this is in pounds of EPD units, not actual total mature weight. This is a genetic trend, not a phenotypic trend. But as you can see, over time, Angus cow genetic trend continues to creep up also. So cows are getting heavier. An interesting component of this is that the genetic trend for mature height has been flat since 1987, indicating that we're no longer selecting for increased frame size. In fact, that's come down in a lot of cases. But weight continues to creep up. What do cows weigh now? This is the most recently published Meat Animal Research Center GPE evaluation data. These are for F1 females sired by the breeds you see at the bottom here. So I think this is surprising to a lot of producers out there, and that is the Hereford cows, the Angus cows, the red Angus cows are maybe slightly, but they are heavier than the Simmental cows. They're heavier than Limousin. They're heavier than the Charolais cows, and they're heavier than the F1 Gelbvieh cows. Kind of a surprise. Like I said earlier, you just can't think about these breeds like we did 20 and 30 years ago. What about muscling? This is a genetic trend for ribeye area. There's no question that we are also aggressively selecting for muscle in cow. There's some positives associated with this characteristic too. Obviously, the reason we're doing this is to have a higher percentage of USDA #1 feeder cattle in the country offered for sale, and then also to reduce the number of yield grade 4s and 5 carcasses, which comes with a pretty substantial market discount. That's the reason. The question is, and my interest is in this presentation is, what good does that do a commercial cow? And the answer is muscling does not go very well with fertility. If you think about, say, for example, a female athlete that's a weightlifter, those extremely muscular females just don't do very well in the reproduction department, and the same goes for almost all species of animals. The answer is not clear. There will be a minor increase in maintenance requirement if we continue this trend for selection for muscling in females. It will increase mature weight. There's no doubt about it, and that's probably one of the biggest reasons why cow weights continue to creep up even though frame size is not increasing. More muscle equals less fat at the same live weight. What does that mean? Well, fat drives reproduction. And so if you don't want to give up on reproduction, what you have to do is keep that cow a little bit larger or heavier to maintain the same pregnancy rate. And that's really what that boils down to. That's why fertility has not changed, but cows continue to get bigger because we're selecting for more muscular cows. That, and at the same time, we're selecting for larger visceral organ mass. Okay, undesirable associations between maternal traits and retail product appear to be mediated through fat thickness. That's just another way to say that fertility is driven by fat composition. This bullet point really kind of says the same thing. Last item then, growth and feed intake, very similar to the last one. There is a relationship between growth and feed intake and a positive genetic correlation. Okay, and here you see what's going on. And this is a relatively recent available EPD provided by the Angus Association. And again, this is the genetic trend. And you see that the genetic trend for feed yard dry matter intake is on a pretty steep incline. And so that's concerning if we're talking about beef cows or females that spend most of their life on moderate to low quality forage on rangeland, and the idea that forage quality could become more limited and lower quality in the future. Increased feed intake and gut capacity results in increased visceral organ mass, just like milk does. Okay, so they are linked. The problem is the GI and liver make up less than 10% of the cow's body mass. But guess what? They combine to use 40 to 50% of the total energy expenditure in a cow. What can we do about these things? How can we better match cows to forage resources in the future? And right now, there are many things going on in the industry that will help us in the future. But right now, some very fundamental things could be put into practice on commercial operations that should help. Those are kind of founded in this, maybe this statement, and that is tough times don't last, but tough cows do. So let me explain that a little bit. How do you improve the match without increasing inputs or artificially modifying the environment? They're pretty simple things. Well, let me just list those. Number one, and what we spent the last few minutes trying to explain, that is, select cattle, bulls, retain females, and so on, with moderate size, mature size, moderate milk, and moderate muscle. Extremes in any one of those three things will move cows further away from that matching ability. Cull open cows. Be willing to challenge them. In other words, don't resist the temptation. Do resist the temptation to gradually modify the environment. And that's just another way to say, let those cows tell you who fit the environment and who do not. And over time, if you're willing to do that, you should wind up with a cow herd that is a better match. Keep only early born heifers, keep only early bred heifers, and keep or buy bulls out of cows that always calve early. So once again, all three of those last bullet points there are basically saying that everything that should have happened, was supposed to have happened from a fertility standpoint, did. It all happened, all the stars lined up, however you want to look at it. And it was a success. Yes, it was a one-time success. It's low, fertility is low in heritability, but it is heritable. And so if that continues to happen time after time after time, and for years, if you keep early bred heifers, you keep early born heifers, and if you purchase bulls out of cows that always calve early and are in people's cow herds for a long period of time, eventually you'll wind up, and cull open cows, you'll wind up with a cow herd with high fertility. Okay, so what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And so I tell our commercial producers here in Oklahoma that you need to find someone, a seed stock producer, that puts a priority on those economically relative traits related to fertility and forage use efficiency. But someone that does not dramatically artificially modify the environment, in other words, challenges those cows to get by with a forage program with moderate to low inputs. They cull open cows, are willing to challenge them, and are willing to let those cows tell them which ones match and which ones don't. Keep only early born heifers, early bred heifers, and puts environmental pressure on their cattle to weed out those that don't match. And then here's another interesting thought, and that is purchase bulls out of cows that are managed like yours are or worse. Just another way to say put pressure on them to perform in an environment that is similar to commercial producers. Not an environment where cows never have a bad day and are always in a body condition score 6 or 7 because they're treated really well, through the winter with the feed bucket or the feed truck or early hay feeding and so on. So to summarize all that, and hope we'll have time here for just a few questions and some discussion. There has been a dramatic improvements in carcass characteristics and a reduction in dystocia. Now, I didn't talk about this in particular, but I don't want you to leave with the idea that I think my philosophy is we've gone in the wrong direction. We have done a lot of things right and made some dramatic improvements. And these are some of those: carcass characteristics and reduction in dystocia, calf birth weights, and so on. However, from a commercial cow standpoint, still, after all these years of availability of EPDs and so on, there is no strong evidence that commercial cow efficiency has improved if we assume a sell at weaning context, okay, for folks that have to or do sell their calves at weaning time. And we spent some time talking about that. From a commercial cow-calf perspective, the industry is on an unsustainable path relative to some traits. And I'm talking about the gradual creep in mature size, muscle, and milk genetic potential for milk. It seems like we continue to aggressively select for those traits, and that's not good for matching commercial cows to their forage resources. Cows are not getting taller, they are getting bigger or heavier. We can't seem to get enough milk, muscle, or growth. The industry continues to aggressively select for those things, and the result in the end is that feed inputs or cost per cow-calf unit are increasing, while limited data suggests that our production is not increasing in those commercial operations. There are a lot of old tools. We mentioned some of those, and new tools that are available. I didn't take any time to go through those. A lot of the animal breeders, the genetics folks at each institution have a lot of information on that and can provide guidance on the newer tools that are available. But my thought is that for the last 20 or so years, the industry has really been focused particularly on improving carcass characteristics, and they've kind of set the commercial cow aside. And I hope we can get back to focusing on improving those commercial cow efficiency and making better matched forage resources. Amber, that's all I've got. Happy to try to answer any questions if there are any.
Alrighty, thank you, Dave. If anybody has any questions, I'll give you a couple of minutes to type those into the chat. Otherwise, that will be it for today. All right, I don't see any additional questions, so that is the end of our webinar for today. Our next webinar is in November. I think we are going with 1:30 on November 24th, and Al Sutherland will be presenting, and he is from the Oklahoma Mesonet. He's going to be presenting on the Cattle Comfort Advisor. So that is to help you in determining whether or not you should make changes in your management practices in order to assist cattle to deal with things like cold temperature extremes and hot temperature extremes. Obviously this time of year, cold extremes are more likely. So that's it for today. Please go ahead and register for our next webinar if you're interested in that. Otherwise, have a great afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you, Amber.